Welcome back to another video, guys. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at more Elden Ring stuff to convert into D&D. Specifically looking at the Frenzied Flame in this video. I'll be covering a mythic stat block that goes into the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC, and taking a look at Midra, the Lord of Frenzied Flame. I'll also be presenting you with a curse that you can give to your players that will allow them to use frenzied abilities like you can in Elden Ring. And along with that curse, there will come a few spells that are conversions of incantations from Elden Ring. We're going to start off with the stat block for Midra. Now, this stat block is a mythic stat block, and it is quite lengthy, so to go through some of the things that make this stat block unique, the first of those things would be the Madness feature. This Madness feature contains a mechanic that somewhat defines Midra's stat block here. The feature states that Midra can apply points of madness to creatures when he hits them with certain abilities, and creatures when they start their turns with points of madness have to make a saving throw that scales up with the amount of points they have. If they fail their saving throw, they lose all of their points of madness, which is good for them, but what's not good is that they are cursed with the Curse of Frenzied Flame. And we'll get into that curse a little bit later after this stat block, but just note that is something that they can contract as part of this failed saving throw. And then notably it says that their curse would increase by a level if they were already cursed, which again, we'll get into that. But additionally, when they fail, their eyes erupt into a burst of frenzied flame, and in a pretty decent radius around themselves, they spew frenzied flame in this radius, just like in Elden Ring when your madness bar fills up all the way. And this has a saving throw involved for other creatures who are in that area to try and save and not take damage from it. And it deals a decent amount of damage and also applies some madness to the creatures that get hit by it. So failing this saving throw is actually not that dangerous to the creature who failed. It's more dangerous to if they have any allies around them. But the fact that it also applies madness to any of those allies of theirs or other creatures that get hit by it means that once one creature gets struck with madness, it can sort of chain react into the other creatures if everybody's failing their saving throws. Now, if they succeed on their saving throw, rather than losing the points of madness and having these negative effects, they just reduce the amount of madness that they have. And depending on how many points they had and what their wisdom modifier is, they might be able to just cure themselves of it right away. Midra's Lord of Frenzy feature is once per long rest, and this is the feature that activates his ability to make use of mythic actions. Once he reaches a certain amount of hit points, lower than his total hit points, about half of his total hit points, he will release an explosion around him that does a lot of damage, and then also activates his mythic actions. And notably, that explosion is a free action to do right when this ability is triggered. And this is fundamentally representing Midra going into his second phase in Elden Ring. His Greater Will feature is basically legendary resistance, but rather than just being a certain amount of times per day, it allows him to cure creatures of their madness in order to reattempt a saving throw. And then his Unending Flame feature says that when a hostile creature deals fire damage to Midra, he may roll to recharge his Flame of Frenzy action if it is not recharged. Which is fairly relevant to his stat block, because although the enemy creatures might avoid using fire damage on a creature that's very obviously throwing out a lot of fire, the Madness feature could cause creatures who are near him to spew frenzied flame from their eyes if they fail their saving throw, and damage Midra in the process, which would allow him to roll recharges. So this does sort of have a feedback loop with his Madness feature. Midra has a multi-attack of 4 attacks that allows him to make 3 with his Greatsword and 1 with his Sweeping Frenzy. Both of these attacks apply madness when they hit, and the Sweeping Frenzy is a cone AoE that does both fire and also psychic damage. Additionally, he has his Flame of Frenzy recharge ability, which is just a much larger cone that does more damage than the other one, except for this also causes creatures that have the Curse of Frenzy to make an attack at the nearest creature other than Midra. He has a bonus action to use his Barbed Dagger to attack a creature. This does all the usual damage and madness points, though this time it is piercing and psychic instead of fire. But what's unique about this attack specifically is that Midra may choose when hitting a creature with this dagger to remove all of the points of madness from that creature that it currently has, and then Midra gains 10 times those amount of points as temporary hit points to himself. Now, this attack applies 4 points of madness by default, so at minimum, if Midra decided to do this when hitting a creature, he would be getting 40 temporary hit points. But there is a chance that he might be getting a lot more than that if the creature he's hitting with it has also been hit by his other abilities. And I would say out of all of the attacks Midra has, this Barbed Dagger attack might actually be his most dangerous attack, or at least his most potent ability, because there is a chance that when he uses this, a creature could have many madness points on them and they just haven't rolled their save yet. They could have like 10 to 15 madness points depending on how specifically Midra targeted them and how well they rolled on their saving throws. So that could lead Midra to getting a very big temporary hit point overshield onto himself. Now, as a reaction, Midra has Shabriri's Woe. This reaction allows him to retort against a creature that is attacking him, and he can give that creature 10 points of madness and then make them immediately make their saving throw against that madness as if it was the start of their turn. Now, what's important about this is that not only does it maybe cause them to fail their saving throw and spew a bunch of Frenzied Flame everywhere, but that spewing of Frenzied Flame as described in the Madness ability, it causes them to use their action to do that, which is why it's so potent. And so this reaction specifically states that if the creature's triggering attack was made using its action and it fails its save, it abandons that action in order to take this spewing of Frenzied Flame action that it has to as part of the madness. So this reaction could essentially nullify an incoming attack if used properly and with a failed save. And I do like that players could actually figure out how this reaction works after it happens once, and then specifically try to bait it out with like bonus action attacks or something. So there is a little bit of counterplay to be done there. Now Midra has 2 legendary actions. The first one is Golden Crux, and this one is quite dangerous. This could potentially be his highest single target damage attack if used correctly. What it does is it allows Midra to move and make a greatsword attack, and if he hits, he can consume any temporary hit points he has to deal piercing damage equal to the amount of temporary hit points lost. And so this is very dependent on how many temporary hit points Midra has, and is something that you might have to play strategically into. But if you as the DM running this monster were able to pull this off, you could potentially use that big 150 temporary hit point overshield that you grabbed to deal a ton of damage to a creature, like 150 points of piercing damage. Now, of course, that consumes your large amount of temporary hit points that you had to defend yourself, but it can be a really surprising tool to use against the players if they're not ready for it, and could definitely turn the tide of a battle. Now, the other legendary action he has actually plays into this legendary action as well, in case you want to use it that way. Field of Barbs is a radius of damage around Midra, but notably, Midra gains temporary hit points equal to the total amount of damage combined dealt to all creatures hit by the attack. Meaning if he's got like 4 creatures around him and he does this, and let's say they all take 20 points of damage, then that's 80 temporary hit points going to Midra. And then Midra has 2 mythic actions that can only be used once he uses his The Lord of Frenzy feature. Gaze of Chaos is a line attack that's 150 feet long and 10 feet wide, and simply just deals damage and madness points. Now the other mythic action, the Lord's Visage, is a bit more of a unique one. Midra creates a flaming duplicate of his own head, and he creates that near him, and then that duplicate seeks out a targeted creature by Midra, and it moves 20 feet towards that target at the end of every creature in initiative's turn. So this is somewhat of a damaging AoE spell, but almost a ticking timer, because it's going to slowly chase after the creature that it was intended to target, and how soon it explodes is really based on initiative order. Now, notably, the conditions for it exploding are if it gets within 5 feet of its target, or at the end of its target's next turn. So if it doesn't make it there, it'll just explode early. And then also this would mean that the target could potentially, if it never makes it to the target before their turn, they could run away to get out of the radius. So a bit more of a unique and niche AoE attack ability that could have your players kind of just scrambling as it slowly moves across the battlefield. Okay, so that was Midra's stat block, a very cool and powerful stat block that introduces this madness into the game for your monsters. And something I want to note about that before I move on to the curse is that this madness feature specifically could be very easily transplanted onto lower level monsters. I know Midra here is a 25 CR monster and is likely something that your players will never get to fight in their game because he's just so powerful, but this also just introduces madness, and you could take this madness feature and put it on a lower level stat block. And I've actually done that here to give you an example of what that would look like. So here I have a null stat block, and this is just a standard null, except for I have transplanted the madness feature here now onto the null. And if you read the feature, basically nothing has changed from the feature. The only thing that's changed is I've changed the word Midra to the null at the beginning of the feature. Everything else here is the same except for the damage and DC of the flame that is spewed out of the creature's eyes if they fail their saving throw. The damage and DC of that is something you're going to want to scale based on the creature, because the DC and damage was a 20 dexterity save and 21 damage on Midra, and that's probably not something you're going to want to have on a Gnoll. So just scale that fire damage and that dexterity save, and then the feature is basically good to just be put on any creature. And that's very accurate to Elden Ring, because in Elden Ring, most of the Frenzied Flame mobs that you fight are just common normal enemies that you would fight anyways, that have been given the Curse of Frenzy. And speaking of curses, I have made a curse here for the Frenzied Flame that your players do contract when they fail their saving throw against that Madness feature. Now, of course, you do not have to use this in your game. This is optional. You can just ignore it on the feature or remove it from the feature on the stat block. But the idea for this feature is going to be if you want your players to be able to use the Frenzied Flame in the game, if you want your players to have access to Frenzied Flame. Now, notably for this curse, I will preface by saying this curse is mostly beneficial. Normally we think of curses as being something that is negative, and this curse does have some negative aspects to it, but it is mostly beneficial. And that's because Frenzied Flame in Elden Ring is something that you can use effectively and make your entire character around in combat in Elden Ring. And so this curse is going to provide a lot of benefits to the players, and that's intentional because the idea would be to present the sort of weighing of the decision of whether the player wants to actually keep the curse or not, because it has benefits, then it also has drawbacks. So reading the curse here, it gives you a little short description of what the curse actually is doing to you. And then we get into actually what this curse does. When you're cursed by this, you start at 1 level of madness on the table below. And as you gain levels of madness, you retain all of the benefits of your lower levels, but the cost changes. So there are benefits listed here for each level of the 3 levels of this curse, but the cost is something that changes each time. However, you get to keep all of your benefits. So at level 1, the benefit you incur is that your melee attacks now deal an additional 1d6 fire damage, and you gain access to the Howl of Shabriri spell. You get it once per long rest, but you can also cast it with additional spell slots after that. So you do get a few spells as part of this curse, and I'll get into those later, but first let's finish reading through the curse. The cost of the curse at level 1 is that after completing a long rest, you cannot benefit from another long rest until you kill a creature that has an intelligence of 6 or higher using fire damage. So our first cost here. Basically, you just need to kill a creature using any sort of fire damage before you can long rest again. Now the stipulation is that the creature has to have an intelligence of 6 or higher. And the reason that stipulation is in there is because we don't want the player to just go kill a squirrel and then be good. And we also want to play into the aspect of Frenzied Flame from Elden Ring. There is sort of a nihilistic philosophy that the chaos of the Frenzied Flame takes in Elden Ring. The general idea of it being that life is inevitably suffering, and so the Frenzied Flame seeks to burn all life in order to basically end their suffering. And so I wanted to make the requirement be a reasonable intelligence or higher, because the creature should be at least conscious of their own suffering in order to qualify for this curse, right? A squirrel probably isn't quite as aware that life is suffering as much as a human is. So moving to level 2, the benefit here is that you get access to the Inescapable Frenzy spell, which again, you get 1 free cast of and then must use spell slots thereafter. And now the cost has changed. You have to kill 2 creatures of an intelligence of 6 or higher before you can long rest again. So this cost has just been increased to now being multiple creatures. And so you might not think that this cost is that high. This is a game about killing creatures, sort of. But keep in mind that your players aren't always doing this. There's a lot of times in your game, especially in cities and villages, where players are not killing creatures every day. They're often doing quest stuff and then taking long rests in order to keep their spells and things up. So this could prove to be quite difficult for a player, especially when they leave any sort of dungeon crawl and start heading into more of the roleplay aspects. Moving to level 3, the third benefit is that you gain access to the Midra's Flame of Frenzy spell. Again, this spell has 1 free cast and then requires spell slots, but also on top of that, when landing a killing blow on a creature with an intelligence of 6 or higher using the spells granted by this curse, you regain the usage or spell slot used to cast the spell. So the benefits have really improved here at level 3, because not only do you have the third spell here, but you also can get your spells back. Either the once per long rest usage you can get back, or the spell slot you used you can get back if you kill a creature using the spell. So this is even further pushing the creature who's been cursed by this to really use the magic provided to them to kill things. And then of course the cost has gone up here as well. You are no longer capable of gaining the benefits of a long rest through resting. Instead, whenever you land the killing blow on a creature that has an intelligence of 6 or higher using fire damage, roll a d20 against a DC of 20. The DC of this roll is cumulatively reduced by 1 each time it is rolled until a success. On a success, you immediately gain the benefits of a long rest and the DC resets to 20. So the cost has changed wildly here now. Instead of just being able to long rest once you kill 1 or 2 creatures, now you never get to long rest. You just have to keep killing, and eventually, mathematically speaking, you will eventually be able to get the benefits of a long rest by killing. Now, mathematically speaking, this drastically increases the amount of creatures that have a high intelligence that the creature will need to kill in order to get long rests. Now, in some cases, the player may get lucky and they may just get a natural 20 on their first roll and then be good and get a long rest immediately upon killing a creature. But more likely than not, they are going to be having to kill quite a few creatures before they get their long rest. And this is going to really push that sort of emphasis on the player going kind of mad trying to constantly kill using fire. More than likely, your player will probably have 1 or more levels of exhaustion by the time they even get their next long rest. And so at this point in the curse is when the player will probably be reconsidering their choice to stick with this curse once they see this cost. Or if you have a player who's been role-playing into this curse, then maybe it will be something they embrace, and it'll be up to their party members to talk them down from it or deal with them. Or maybe just lean into it and everybody becomes cursed. So that's the curse of Frenzied Flame, and it gives both some fun roleplay sort of madness and chaos to your party, as well as also giving some power to them and introducing the Frenzied Flame. Now, let's look at those 3 spells that they get as part of the curse and see what they do. So first up, the Howl of Shabriri is a 2nd level spell, and what it does is you howl in a 15-foot radius around you, and creatures that are within the radius are inflicted with points of madness. They gain 1d6 plus your spellcasting modifier points of madness. Now also notably, if you pay attention to the text, it says you and any creatures within the radius get this madness. So you, the caster as well, also gain madness. Just like in Elden Ring, whenever you use these incantations in Elden Ring, you build up your own madness meter along with the enemies. Now, as far as what happens when you get madness from the spell, well, the madness you get here works the exact same as the madness feature on the stat block before, on Midra's stat block. This is basically word for word the same thing. The damage and DC have just been changed to fit. So what's cool about this is basically you're giving your players access to the same thing that the monster had. Now they too can apply points of madness to their enemies and make their enemies make those saving throws, and potentially have their enemies be cursed by the same curse that they have. But also, funnily enough, because they're giving themselves points of madness from this too, that means that they're going to have to maybe roll these, which is both a downside but also could be seen as a benefit to this spell, and why this spell could actually be stronger than it might seem. Because you might actually want to give yourself madness and then fail your own saving throw, because then you get to do that sort of bursting of frenzied flame from your eyes in a radius. So you could use this spell strategically to make yourself fail your saving throw. And notably, it still has the wording in here of the spell like the feature did, where if somebody fails their save and is already cursed, their curse goes up by a level. So now we see how you go up in levels on the curse, because I read the curse before, but it did not have any sort of rules as written on how you level up your curse. This is how. Using these spells causes your level to go up. If you fail your madness saving throws, your curse level goes up. So it's really only an inevitability that someone using these spells is eventually going to raise their level. And as they get access to more of these spells, their level will continue to rise easier and easier. Now, also notably, if you upcast the Howl of Shabriri, it does raise the radius by 5 feet for each level. Now, moving to Inescapable Frenzy, it is a 3rd level spell. and this one requires you to make a melee spell attack with it. If you hit, you deal a decent amount of damage to the target, but you also inflict yourself and the target with points of madness again, and this time with more points of madness than Howl of Shabriri. And then again, the same madness sort of feature here is the bulk of the spell, and the damage and DC of the dexterity save has gone up. And then when you upcast the spell, you increase the damage of the spell's initial d12s of fire damage. And then finally we have Midra's Flame of Frenzy spell. This one is a 5th level spell and is concentration. As a bonus action, you can summon the flaming head of Midra above you. And then while concentrating on the spell, once per turn, you can use your action to spew frenzied flame in a 30-foot radius around you. This deals a decent amount of damage and also inflicts madness on the targets again. And it also inflicts you with madness each time you use this action to spew the flames. However, you don't get any madness when you initially cast the spell. It's just when you use your action while concentrating to do the area of effect damage. And then again, the madness is handled in the same way as that madness feature. And then upcasting the spell increases the damage of the AoE. So that was the end of this video, converting Frenzied Flame from Elden Ring into D&D. Let me know what you guys thought of it. Leave a comment, like, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video.